at us. We look good. We're like ready to go.
Thank you so much, Yvette. First of all, we would like to welcome you. My co-founder, Mr. Path, has few questions regarding misconceptions of US visa application and US visa officers, and you're the best person to answer that. Can you please help me with that?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to work with the Embassy of Education and to do this for our listeners. So, some misconceptions, I've heard quite a few. One of them is that visa officers have a quota. So, approval or denial quota. That's not true. Officers definitely want to approve as many qualified applicants as possible, but we do have a quota where we have to hit a certain number of visas a day. In India, it's about 120 before noon, so in a 3-hour span. So that's why you see visa officers going a little crazy at the window and getting in as many applicants as they can, because if they don't hit their quota, then their colleagues next to them have to pick up the slack, because obviously we can't go to lunch until everybody at the in the lobby is serviced. So it's a lot of pressure due to the demands of the Indian government on getting as many visas as possible. So that does have a little bit of pressure. But in terms of quotas of approval or denial, not there. Okay. So the second thing is that people believe that we have all of their information. We have all their tax information. I think this is a particularly bad misconception, because when you're wealthy, you're like, oh, of course I'm going to get the visa. They have all my tax records. They know I'm a millionaire. We don't know that. If you don't tell us, we don't know that. The other way this can be just not well received is when people don't account for what in India called like black money, right? So you have businesses in India, and a student will say, hey, my parents make like 10 lakh a year, but they're going to UCLA and the tuition is super high and it's not making sense to the officer. Well, that's because their father is a businessman and they really make 30 lakh a year, but they're not reporting that at the window. So we don't know all your taxes, and officers generally don't necessarily care. They're not going to report anything to the Indian government. They just want the full financial picture. So just make sure that you understand that your interview and the way you verbally communicate is mostly what the officer knows and sees, and we don't have a lot of documents in terms of finances. So that's a misconception. And I think the last misconception is students really believe that the F1 visa, so we're going to be here, we're talking about in general, both B visas and F1 visas. So just so that our audience knows. So I'll go back and forth and I'll try to be as clear as possible. But for F1 students, a misconception, they always say, well, my university is going to make or break my visa interview. And that's a huge misconception. I was with my colleagues and we were doing a session. It was like called a norming session, meaning we're trying to get our adjudication as close to each other as possible so that applicants have a fair opportunity at the window. And one officer kind of shocked me by saying I denied an applicant that was going to Northeastern. Northeastern, I love Northeastern. It has a huge Indian community, for example, and I think it's a fantastic school. And to get into Northeastern is not easy. And so for that officer to say they rejected somebody going to Northeastern, while another officer was saying that, they approved another applicant going to maybe an easier school to get into. Why is that? And I, don't know if I necessarily would have approached it that way. And the reason was because the person that was going to Northeastern could not tell the officer at all why they're going to Northeastern, but the person that was going to the school that was a bit easier to get into had a really great reason for wanting to go to that program. So if you think about it, it makes sense. You can get into a top school. That means that you're prepared. So we adjudicate on preparedness, financial stability, but also your intent as a student. So just because you get into a top school, we still want to make sure, are you going to finish the program, or are you just going to go to Northeastern because you have like other plans, right? So the school doesn't matter as much as your communication of why you want to go to that school. So definitely always remember that, and don't be discouraged if maybe you didn't get into a top school. Yeah. So those are it.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. That will really help our audience.
Sure.
Just a small question. people have misconception, and we have started receiving questions also that, okay, if somebody is rejected by UK or Canada, will officer at US consulate will come to know regarding this or not?
So some questions are a little bit more security related. So so I can't necessarily answer them outright in good conscience. But I would say to people who are more concerned about that is just it doesn't really matter what they
Okay.
know about you technically on that end. Always be as honest as possible and communicate to the visa officer why you want to go to the US, because ultimately, whether you were rejected from Canada or the UK or not, now you're going for your visa interview. Is that really going to determine whether or not you're going to go for your interview? Like, probably not. So just do like the best you can, you know?
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really. Thank you
Sure.
so much. Parth.
Yeah. So you had like we have come across with people, who take things casually. When it comes to DS-160, they fill up some random information to take it
Right.
casually, and that may cause damage to their visa applications. Can you please show us throw some light on this? What is the importance of DS-160?
It's really interesting because so I worked in India for 5 years in Embassy New Delhi and Mumbai, pre-COVID, post-COVID. And it's amazing how many people take the visa interview casually. Even though statistically, you have like a 25 to 45% chance of not doing well on that visa interview. So definitely never take the visa interview casually at all. The DS-160 especially is one of the only pieces of documentation, and I think we'll talk about documents later, that the officer is going to look at. So it's the document that's going to have all your bio data, where you're going to be in the United States, the countries that you're going to go to. So with the intense pressure on officers to adjudicate as many visas as possible, they want to get to know you as quickly as possible. So for me, I will look at that DS-160. I want to know. I look at things. I'm like, oh, they live in defense colony. That's nice. I look at that. Don't think that doesn't matter. I'll look at the back. So the things that I look at is that DS-160. I'll look at the back of your passport, see where you're from, go through your passport. These are things that I can quickly look at in order to determine your socioeconomic status, because that's one of the pillars of approval, right? So if you so some applicants will sound a bit unhinged on the DS-160 and start typing notes to the officer. Dear ma'am officer, dear sir officer, you need to approve my visa because I love LA. Please don't say that. That's not going to present well on the DS-160. It's funny, I'll chuckle. But you need to be really filling out that form as completely as possible, as accurately as possible, with good grammar. If you have a 214B denial, definitely mention that you do have it, but for the reason box, don't say anything. There's nothing that you can say that can help you like on that form. I on the DS-160 for F1 students, they're so humble. They don't think that their internships matter, but they do matter. So in the United States, people in undergrad generally don't do a lot of internships. Like, it kind of is a symbol of excellence. So for you as an Indian, maybe that's not a big deal, but for an officer, it's a huge deal. So just know that. Mention your internship, even though it's not a paid experience. Mention the roles and responsibilities on that DS-160. So these are some things that, make sure your full name, date of birth, place of birth, nationality is important. Travel information is there. Your family information is there. So it's good to avoid making common mistakes on that form for sure. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderfully
Sure.
explained.
Yeah. So there's one more question from the audience was like, how does seeking guidance from let's say Embassy of Education, Unity Visa, that will make a huge difference in the visa application process, especially DS-160 form submission process.
Okay. So so let me give you an example. Okay. So if you're going for an Ernest and Y interview, and say you have a consultancy that makes sure that your resume is perfect, and they've done a ton of resumes for Ernest and Young, right? And then you have somebody who actually interviewed applicants for Ernest and Young, and they're the ones who approved or denied those applicants. So if you're somebody who, say, is going to Harvard and has this perfect profile and has lots of travel, maybe you can do it on your own. But for everybody else, with the visa rejection rates the way they are, having somebody who has filled out that resume, knows what Ernest and Young is looking for, and having interview guidance or having a prep session with somebody who actually worked at that company, do you think you would perform better when it came down to the interview? Because we tell you what to expect, we tell you what they're looking for, we tell you how to structure it, right? Because we've seen that. So going into visas, if you're somebody on the spectrum where you've never traveled before, maybe your finances are not stable and you simply don't qualify for a visa, maybe that's not an investment that you want to make. Maybe you should, do a little bit of research and understand the basic parameters of approval are, good intent to travel well and use your visa well, the financial stability to travel, all those pillars, right? Like especially for a B visa. Or on the other extreme where you have lots of travel, but everybody else in between, you're at risk. You really are. We're not just saying that to make money. Like, you are at risk because the process is really based on your ability to communicate to the officer, your DS-160 and your ability to communicate to the officer. And that's it. So many people are qualified for the visa, but they're not able to communicate with the officer in the time allowed, which is literally 1 minute. That's the problem. You want, the visas to be given, but at the same time, if you had 10 minutes with the officer, I'm sure the visa denial rates would go down, but that's not the way the system is. So now you have to communicate succinctly. So employing the help of companies who can help you fill out the DS-160 appropriately, tell you like, hey, this doesn't, sound well. Did you add your internship? Is this your complete address? Make sure you're putting in that information, or even giving you more tips than that. And I think we'll talk about more tips. And then employing the help, especially if you've had prior refusals, of somebody who was a former consular officer and is able to tell you how to best present your case. I think it's just an invaluable resource for preparation.
Thank you so much. Cricket is a very popular game in India. And they
Yeah.
say your most experienced batsman or the player should be the best coach of the game. So this
Yeah,
is
that's
how we
true.
can define it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette. The next question is, what are some primary supporting documents like, people should carry for, let's say, for B1, B2, as well as for student, a common set of
Okay.
documents?
Okay. So again, due to a short amount of time and the ability to fake documents, we officers do not look at a lot of documents. So let's start with B1, B2.
Mhm.
B1, B2, the only thing that is generally going to be looked at or useful is if you have a copy of the visa of the person that you're visiting. So for moms and dads of F1 students out there, or moms and dads of H1Bs, have a copy of the visa of that individual in the United States. That's going to be helpful. Okay. They're also going to look at the passport. So if you are newly married and your husband has had a visa, bring that passport, update your own passport to reflect that person's name. So these are things that can't. These are the things that are going to be useful, because the officer is going to take the copy of that visa. They're going to look up. They're going to say, "Oh yes, this person is enrolled, or this person is working for Amazon in the United States." Fantastic. So that's great. Everything else is going to rely on the verbal communication between you guys. If you want to have other assets or other documents, go ahead and go for it. Also have a copy of your barcode page, the barcode page of that DS-160 that's filled out online. And I will say, regardless of who you use to help you with the DS-160, you need to know exactly what is on the DS-160, understand what that document means, and take responsibility and ownership for making sure it's perfect. Have a copy of that. Once you go through the DS-160 process online, that document also says what you can and can't bring inside the consulate so that you're adhering to the rules and you're not freaking out the day of. This is basically all you need. Nothing else is going to be looked at or even considered. For F1 students, obviously your I-20. Know what is on your I-20, especially if it's a pathway program. A lot of students can't communicate pathway programs very well. They need to do better. Have that I-20 with you, have that barcode page of the DS-160. All other documents, you can put them aside. If you have a scholarship letter, maybe that's something you can maybe show an officer, but in terms of immovable assets, finance documents, your checkbook, it's just not going to be looked at.
Got it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
When it comes to home ties, I mean, why is it so essential to demonstrate those home ties to the home country?
Okay, so it's a complicated question. I'm just going to briefly try to tackle it. All right, so for B1, B2 applicants and F1 students, in generally speaking, the officer wants to see that you have enough in your home country where you're not going to risk misusing the visa or never returning. So that's where home ties comes in. So in the very simplest way, that you have something to lose. That's number one. So 214B is a code for the INA 214B. It's a code that a lot of applicants get on their refusal referencing that specific policy. And a lot of them will see home ties.
Right.
But really 214B is a blanket refusal that can be given if you don't convince the officer of intent, if the officer doesn't feel convinced of your financial means, and yes, they'll adjudicate based on home ties. Now for students, home ties, don't worry about them. Okay, don't worry about home ties at all, because you just go there and you convince them that you are going for your studies and that this is an important course for you. This is a program that's really important to you, and the school that you're going to, you have a reason for going there, and you're able to give a good depiction of your finances. That's what a student should worry about, because they're young, they don't necessarily have the ties because they're young, and that's an expectation that the officer knows. Now when home ties comes into play for a student is if a student, for example, is going for a master's program and they went for mechanical engineering for undergrad and they have a good GPA, do I think that that student is going to risk everything and never, just not show up to their master's program? So in a way, you're demonstrating home ties by how prepared you were as a student and how seriously you take your studies, because in that case, you have something to lose. This is a very simplified explanation. Moving on to B1, B2 visas. So home ties is a little bit of a higher bar there, because with the F1, we're expecting young, right? We're expecting that profile but the leisure traveler or the business traveler, we're expecting that you have at least some means to finance a trip to the United States. Now, when it comes to India, when the average income is, 7, 8, 10 lakhs a year, and the average cost of a trip to the United States is 7, 8, 10 lakhs a year, things need to add up. You need to have a reason for going to the United States. You need to have the financial means. So with home ties there, we assess, immovable property. So people need to be talking about immovable property. Maybe their income is not that high, but they have immovable property. They have something to lose. Marriage kind of establishes a greater connection to the home country. Their education, if their education ties them to their home country. Again, is somebody who has invested so much and gone to school going to just throw that all away? So they start to assess home ties in that way. So just in general, that's the general idea. That's why when you see single young men going and maybe that is a refusal based on home ties. And in that case, if that individual maybe does not have the ties or maybe is not as qualified, it might behoove them to wait until they're a little bit more established to go for that visa, where it's starting to make sense.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. You covered my next question. That was like the way to demonstrate home ties, but you have extensively covered in my previous question. So what are the top reasons for rejections, like, especially for visitor visa, like common reasons?
The common reasons for rejection.
Right.
Okay. I'm going to tell you guys a story, and maybe
Uh-huh.
we can edit this out if it's not great.
That's okay.
All right. Okay. So you have a family,
Uh-huh.
and this is actually based loosely on a story that I have heard and worked with. So on one side of the family, it's a mom and a dad and a student in high school.
Mhm.
And they come up to the visa officer and they ask, and the visa officer's like, "Why are you going to the United States?" And they say, "Oh, I want to go to LA, maybe Niagara Falls, maybe Miami. How long are you going to?" 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. We were going to get the visa first. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but we're going to get the visa first, and then we're going to figure out our itinerary. Okay, so what do you do? I'm a real estate agent. Okay, what does your wife do? She's a beautician. What's your son do? He's a high school student. Okay, so you want to go for leisure. Have you traveled anywhere before? Oh, we've been to Dubai one time. Okay, what's your income? 10, 15 lakhs a year. Okay. Now the officer, I think that would be, leaning towards a no, potentially a borderline case. Um, that's kind of the position the officer is in because they're assessing, what's their intent of travel?
Right.
Um, do I have time to dig deeper into this story? Maybe if they had time to dig deeper, it would be a yes. On the face value, if the officer has doubts, can they afford this? Why are they going? It's going to be a no. Okay. On the other side of it, this is the same exact family, but like I told them how to essentially communicate their actual profile. So this is the actual profile of the family. So they come up to the visa window and it's like, why are you going to what's your purpose of travel to the United States? Like, we want to go to the United States for 2 weeks. We want to go to Las Vegas and LA. My son is in high school. He's going to a top program in mechanical engineering for undergrad. Eventually, he wants to get his master's in the United States. We're thinking of visiting some colleges on the West Coast. We think the weather sounds lovely. We have some colleagues there. And that is why we're going to the United States. We're intending on, specifically also within LA going, checking out Hollywood, something specific. Okay, wonderful. So what do? I'm a real estate broker and a senior construction project manager. I oversee 20 people. Fantastic. What does your wife do? My wife is a franchise owner of a boutique and a salon. This is a true story. Like, this is really their profile.
Got it.
Okay, fantastic. What is your annual income? Our annual income is 25 lakhs. However, we have 5 to 6 lakhs additional due to the immovable property besides our home that we rent out. Okay, fantastic. Do you know anybody else in the United States? We have some distant relatives, but as I mentioned, we have some colleagues there. Okay, awesome. Visa approved. Like,
Got it.
this is literally a real story of how applicants in India present versus reality. I mean, obviously not all the time, but these are the applicants that we're talking about when we talk about proper preparation. What do you guys think? What do you think of that story?
It was
That was
fantastic.
fantastic.
And that was the best example to understand how it should be.
And you have
Right.
properly explained like how a visa officer is looking at your answers.
Right. I mean, I feel like it's got to be like I say like why are Indians doing this? I feel like I shadow and I talk to applicants from other parts of the world and they have no problem telling me that they're CEOs of everything, and I feel like Indians just tend to be a little humble. It's the way that they present, and also they sometimes they get so nervous and they don't know exactly how to answer a question. So they shrink back and it looks a little bit like they're hiding something, or they use the word maybe instead of just directly saying no, which that kind of indirectness, the officer is just, we can talk about the mood of the officer on that one. Is that the next question?
Yeah, yeah, you got it right. So that's the biggest question, and that's the biggest, everybody that comes to us with refusal, having 214B. they're like, the officer, she was not in good mood or he was not in good mood, and this is the reason my visa got refused. And this is where, like, I've got more than 1,000 people, talk to me regarding the moods of officers. So please describe, how about your mood?
Okay. So the job is rough. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. Probably the hardest job I've ever done. Did it for 5 years. You know, God bless every visa officer out there. They're fantastic people. I'm going to tell you, they want to give you the visa if you're properly explaining why you need to go. In India, it's one of the most intense situations in terms of pressure to adjudicate a certain number of visas. And it's constant work, right? But the mood of the officer is not going to make or break your visa interview. It's kind of understanding what puts the officer in a bad mood. Okay. So, what puts the officer in a bad mood is indirect communication. So, the issue with the India American officer is that they have a different way of communicating. You know, like I was saying before, an Indian's way of saying no is maybe, they don't want to disappoint you. And an American's way of saying no is no. Like, so this is just one example of the mood of the officer. If you go up to the visa officer and they ask you a question and you don't want to give a direct answer, so you start talking about something else. The officer's immediately going to be so angry, like on the inside, because they only have 1 minute with you and they just want you to answer the question directly. Do you know anybody in the United States? Well, America is such a lovely country, and it's like, come on, man. Like, so it's
My
it's
God.
it's so you're putting them in that position. You're putting them a little bit like in that position where, so if you were talking to an Indian, say the officer is Indian, for example, and they ask that question, immediately the Indian might be like, okay, so they know somebody in the United States, like they don't want to answer that question. Maybe and they might not even get upset about it. They might just be like, okay, so tell me who you know. They might not even ask the question again, but an American officer might be like, excuse me, sir, I asked you if you know anybody in the United States. And again, the applicant might be like, maybe, and so now you're getting in a position where the officer just wants to move forward and they can't. This is just one example of how the officer, during the duration of your own personal interview, can be in a not a great mood because they just want this to be an efficient process, and the applicant's got all day, that like, but the officer doesn't. So that's just one example of how mood can affect it. And so if you have a patient officer that is willing to just spend a little bit more time, this can be an approval. But if you have an officer that automatically their thought process is going to be negative, like this person is hiding something, now you're going to get not an approval. And it could be the same exact applicant with the same exact profile, but the communication is now the make it or break it, right?
Right. So this is where my question is importance of interview training, because see, it's all about after, like, hearing from you, it seems like US visa is all about personal interview. So how important is interview training when it comes to US visa?
Okay. So I hate the fact that like the process is as such where, and then in countries where communication is so vastly different, it's even harder for applicants. Truly, I do. I don't want it to be that way, but the system is not going to change anytime soon. Congress is not going to make things better. So the importance of interview training is a must. Now, your level of need for interview training can vary. So for example, if you're going to a good school, you have good communication skills, and you're working with like company like Embassy of Education, they have their own advisors. Maybe you don't need to make the investment to jump to a professional visa officer, but you do need to train, whether it's in front of a mirror, whether it's reading free blogs, going to a YouTube channel. You definitely need someone to help you. And I think for students, that's a given. They do tie up with like Embassy of Education. For B1, B2 applicants, because they don't need help with a education application, they may not necessarily think that visa training is a necessity. And it kind of is, the level of training, who you get it with, it can vary, but you need to go to somebody who, has a track record of having good visa conversions. Now, if you've had a prior refusal, I would highly suggest that you take the help of like myself or of like a former consular officer, because once you get to be on the more complicated side of things, but you don't want to wait until you have that prior refusal. But once you have that prior refusal, it's like if you were a judge convicted you of something and now you're going for an appeal. It's not a fresh case. Don't think it's a fresh case. It's not. One officer, we respect each other as officers and we respect the decisions of other officers. You have to show one officer that previous officer missed something. So you can't just go in with the same story and the same everything and expect to get an approval when you've been refused before. Now, if your profile is not conducive to being eligible for a visa, wait a few years, try again when you're more established. But if you're like that story of the family that I talked about, where you really are qualified for the visa, you're qualified for that visa. Now you really need to be honest and say, the communication went wrong. We need a little bit of help. So having one refusal, you can still overcome it. Don't go for that second. You start to go for the third, things are going to go down. Like, people come to me and they have, 3 refusals. Sometimes I tell them I don't take their money. I just say, you know what? I don't know if you have a chance right now. So I'm gonna just not even, and for some people they might have a chance, and it depends on how long ago that refusal is. But honestly speaking, it's like a judge said no 3 times and now you're going for that 4th appeal. It's difficult. It's an uphill battle. Try to get it the first time. If you have a prior refusal after that one time, you have to do your due diligence. So I hope I'm answering that as honestly as possible,
Oh, yes,
for
you
you
are.
guys.
Yes, you are.
Yes. You were really honest.
Okay.
Thank you so much
Thank you
for
so
that.
much.
Sure.
And thank you so much for all your lovely answers, and that will really help, my audience and my students and my customers as well. To conclude this webinar, I would like to ask a final advice. That okay? Any final word of advice for our viewers? And specifically people who do this, like they think that okay, we make documents, we forward documents and we get visa, specifically on that.
Oh, no. So I was I was the deputy fraud prevention manager in Mumbai, and I saw a student who had really great really great scores in his undergrad, and this person who really wanted to make his parents proud. And he was at my visa window. And why was he? And he was at my FPU window. He was taken into secondary. That's not what we call it. But so I was like talking to him, and the thing we caught was a fake employment letter. So he was going for a master's program, and some agent convinced him that he needed to fill his 6 months gap. And I'm not even going to touch the gap question right now, because it's like, you don't need to account for every minute. Okay, guys, you don't need to account for every minute of your life with a visa officer. That whoever is telling you that, please don't believe them. So now you have this fantastic student who listened to somebody, paid 12,000 rupees, 15,000. Sometimes they pay way more than that. And so this student had a fake letter. This is misrepresentation. This is using a fraudulent document and offering it to an official. You brought that into the consulate of Mumbai and you gave that letter to the officer. You're a great kid. You had a bright future ahead of you. That officer was going to approve your visa. And when the officer is intending on approving your visa and they find you with any sort of fraudulent document, that's an automatic 6C1, which means misrepresentation, a ban for life to the United States, which is what this kid got. In addition, he was arrested and his parents were called. He was crying. Why? Because he had a 6-month gap letter that he worked at some company that he never worked at.
Thank you so much.
Guys, like it's serious. It's so sad. Like, big mistake.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your piece of advice, and it was really great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And we really appreciate that. Thank you.
You. Take
Thank you so
care.
much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.